Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, monthly webinar held by Ksapa.org. Advise, invest, and advocate. Today, we will explore the following topic: leadership lessons of the Great Recession, option for economic downturns. It's a webinar which is part of a series which started back in January, exploring multiple aspects of how companies can address the transformations coming with the environmental, digital, and social challenges, which of course have been completely disrupted or accelerated through COVID-19. I would start with practicalities, and these are our online meeting instructions. Feel free to name yourself so people know who you are. You are automatically muted. That's a way to ensure high quality of the discussion we can have. And to interact with us, you need to use the chat function. You can send questions directly to the moderator or to the whole group if you want. The participant list is accessible notably through LinkedIn. It's not the full list, but that gives you a good idea of those who participate. There is no need to turn on the camera. It's a way to maximize the bandwidth and minimize the energy footprint of this webinar. And last, a poll will be activated for the last 10 minutes, and we'll be delighted to get your feedback. It's just 3 questions, but that's always useful. And our panelists will be presented slightly later on. I will start with a brief introduction about what we are doing at Ksapa. That's a way for all of you to understand better our perspective and how we're coming to this very important discussion today. And I'm hopeful that that will give you a good flavor of how we operate. Ksapa, some people know, some don't. At the end of the day, that's coming from a American word, and that means discernment, wisdom. And at the end of the day, we've been established as a global initiative ensuring that corporations and investors can accelerate their contribution to the following topic: climate, human rights, and inclusive growth, and circularity. And that's we do that with solutions helping those companies and investors to generate more resilient and inclusive growth. We do this through 3 activities. Many of you in this community know us, having worked with us through our advisory services. And that's actually, we frame typically some strategic priorities, and we help companies to build alignment on what an inclusive growth program can imply and mean for them. Most interestingly, because we've been established today, that's because we think that a lot of the solutions that are available to date are not sufficient. So we explore closely how digital solutions and how innovative financing solutions can enable corporations and investors, as much as their ecosystems of broader stakeholders, to accelerate their transformation models and their contribution to climate, circularity, human rights, inclusive growth agenda. We're set up as a .org organization. We're a purpose-driven organization, and that's the 3rd pillar of our activities. We don't only advise and invest, but we also advocate, and we share through our blog articles, briefing papers, regular webinars like this one, in an open source manner, several content bringing insight to our community as a way to enable people to learn, educate, and implement solutions. We operate with 3 circles. We have a team. We're headquartered in Paris, France. We have a team. We operate with a circle of 150 plus partners based across the world, with active programs in the US, for example, or in Southeast Asia. And we have strategic partners, organizations which bring complementary expertise that we don't have in-house. Typically, when we design impact investing solutions, we work with global agencies providing legal and accountancy services. When we design digital solutions, we work with people bringing some data science expertise, which we don't have in-house, as a way to manage the related complexity. These are example sources of briefing papers and other content that we produce, which are all available on our website on the publication section. that we have. Just want to flag a briefing paper that is framing some of this conversation today. That was released at the beginning of the year. 5 areas where business can encourage inclusive growth. We'll display some of the outcome of that briefing paper later on. That's the 5 areas where we focus our strategy and investing activities. As you can see, these are basically the 5 levels on which we focus our work today. And our advisory and investment solutions enable basically to support the definition of strategy and action plan, and to build financial and digital coalitions, maximizing resources addressing multiple aspects of what an inclusive growth agenda can imply, typically working and addressing the recent working condition issues, and respect of human rights throughout the value chain, among other things we do. Let's move on to the core of the topic, and I will just take a few minutes to introduce to the topic briefly, and then of course I'll make the most of the presence of our panelists today, who will contribute and share a perspective which will be very diverse, and part of my job will be today to ensure that we can connect the dots across that wealth of knowledge that is taking part in this discussion today. Very briefly, when we talk about what makes that COVID-19 sanitary crisis and the related economic recession different or similar to what we've seen in the past, we just wanted to frame that conversation with a few words, and of course then explore with our panelists some of the sample solutions that are available and which any company or investor can activate. We just wanted to share with many of the people who have contributed to the development of those contents a few elements. What is similar with the crisis that is underway is just a few things. For example, the scale. At the end of the day, every major crisis operates at a scale which can be similar, and we've seen a drop in greenhouse gases emission related to recent lockdown across the globe, which to some extent has been similar to what we've seen in previous financial crises, where the subprime crisis generated also its drop of GHG emissions. So in that sense, the scale is similar. Crises, as always, accelerate transformations. Today, we see an acceleration typically that is happening on digital transformations, but in the past, every industrial revolution has been closely attached to major global recessions. And last but not least, and very pertinent to our agenda today, these crises accelerate and amplify inequalities at a level which is just building on the level of inequalities which had been skyrocketing for decades, but the crisis amplifies even more that trend. However, there are 3 things that might be flagged being particularly different with this crisis and making an inclusive growth agenda even more pertinent for the discussion that we can have. First, this crisis challenges the benefits of globalization. Just from the perspective of supply and continuity, it is clear that a lot of business decision makers are increasingly wondering to which extent they should not relocate some of the sourcing of their activities. This is pretty new in the sense that a lot of the decision makers would generally embrace globalization. So that's different. The second aspect of the sanitary crisis and the way the recession that is related to it is that solutions provided and policies provided by governments to date have been challenged, but are increasingly more challenged, again, by the same community of investors and business leaders, because they've realized, typically if you look at the investments which have been made in health policy and healthcare systems, just to take an example, it's just not proven to be able to address a sanitary crisis, which could have been not that major with different investment that could have been made up to now. So governments are seriously challenged with this crisis, which is building on a lot of the frustrations which have been expressed for the past decades, which make the question of how we build more inclusive model even more important. And last aspect that we wanted to share, so as part of the introduction of this webinar today, is that decision makers we work with have to face a very, very challenging moment when, on the one hand, they need to really think about long-term impact and vision, meaning that they really need to understand what will make their business model resilient on the long term and able to create value and maintain competitiveness. And at the same time, the crisis and the way generates a level of uncertainty that is extremely high, which encourages to push the concept of agility to its maximum. So you have this conflicting concept of long-term vision that needs to combine with very, very, very short-minded agility, which of course is fundamentally conflictual in essence. And so some of the solutions to address those from the perspective of business and investor decision makers is increasingly to really think in terms of purpose. At the end of the day, when you work with employees who collaborators or business partners, you in telework models, purpose is even more meaningful and important because that's basically what might cement a community that becomes increasingly more virtual. The concept of resilience is important as well, in the sense that that's a way for decision makers to really think about how to navigate the turbulences. Today we're talking about sanitary crisis. We know that the recession is extremely violent and it creates a very explosive social context across the globe. And on top of that, we know that the environmental crises continue to increase in magnitude, meaning that the capacity to build a resilience able to navigate this combination of sanitary, social, and environmental crises is extremely high and extremely important. In response, there is no solution for any company, any investor to think resilience without capacity to think about inclusiveness. Why? Simply because you cannot create and generate value on your own. You're part of an ecosystem. And because you're part of an ecosystem, you need to understand how to better share values. If you want to relocate sourcing activities, you need to understand how to make the most and invest in local education, local capacities, local infrastructures. Long story short, being more inclusive in the way you think business and value creation is even more important in response to the crisis. Last opening remark, which we wanted to bring to your attention, is coming with this concept of controversies and the response to date that we've seen across the past 6 months, which to some extent is interesting and provides a lot of reasons to believe in, to feel that there are reasons to be optimistic because innovation and solutions come to crisis, but at the same time, there are reasons to be also very concerned because the social explosive context and the poor global geopolitical context increases uncertainties in which business and financial decision makers need to make decisions. And we believe that in response, more, and that's a belief which we're sharing with our community. We believe that more human rights, more inclusiveness is part of the solution rather than less. And when we look across the controversies, which you can see outlined in the screen as we speak, typically that there are some of the companies or buyers basically who cancel orders and which can affect millions of workers, that basically destroys trust. And how do you want to recover from a crisis if you destroy trust with your close ecosystem and close partners? It's not working. So more human rights, more inclusive growth is needed, and that's really part of the solution at a time when, because the crisis costs money, at a time where there are less taxes pouring funds of governments, an easy position would be to instead call for less regulation, less taxes. And we believe that this is likely to increase issues and problems. So in conclusion, and as a summary, that will frame the way we will move to the next part of our discussion with our panelists in a minute. There are three closing points that we wanted to share today, and they will frame the conversation going forward. First, it is important to find a good way to strike the balance between what's needed to protect existing assets on the one hand, and at the same time, learn from experience and build or rebuild trust. We've worked with several companies in multiple environments recently, and we've seen across the recent crisis, for example, that whenever we had a positive, good, constructive dialogue and engagement between companies and employees, companies and stakeholders, or even between investors and companies, that was fruitful and a good foundation to navigate the crisis positively. When instead we had to face very conflictual situations prior to the sanitary crisis, well, navigating the crisis had proven to be even more complicated. So every company has to learn from that and try to find the right balance between maintaining positions and preserving assets. And we'll talk about what's the right level, for example, to maneuver between layoffs and other solutions, ensuring that short-term solutions to reduce costs can be put in place to respond to the violence of the crisis on the one hand, and at the same time, how to secure loyalty and commitment of stakeholders, employees, business partners, and ecosystem operating in the environment, so the regions, the territories where companies have activities. The second closing remark connecting to the panel discussion is how companies can identify levers for growth. Here, it's all about learning from the crisis. As we said, every crisis is an opportunity to accelerate transformations. We see big trends happening in terms of digital, environmental, and social transformations underway anyway, and how companies can re-identify the right levers which can be adapted to their portfolio if we're talking to investors and their assets, or to companies if we're talking about their assets as owners of industrial assets, for example. A short and easy response is clearly to invest in people and infrastructural systems. People, and typically that can be about education and capacity building and ensuring that people can adapt to digital transformations underway. Systems that can be about investing massively in the digital infrastructure of a company, or that could be about engaging very closely with the territories and the relevant authorities operating in the surrounding areas of assets to really understand how best to maximize taxes that can be generated in local areas, to maximize investment, building or rebuilding infrastructures that brings positive externalities for business and financial portfolios to create more value. Last point, prepare inclusive growth. That's a point where it's important to think, and that's part of our DNA, so it's pretty easy for us to talk about that, to think about innovative solutions, ensuring that companies can manage the complexity that in the scale of transformations that they need to face. And that, of course, addressing global issues. And we believe that among many levers, the questions of maximizing liquidities available today, serving purposes of circularity, climate and energy transitions, education and other inclusive growth levers that have been displayed in the screen a little bit earlier are very, very important and promising on the one hand. We also believe that the digital revolution and the way generates an unprecedented level of solutions, innovative solutions to manage complexity at a scale that we've not been able to manage before. We work on those areas, so we remain interested to keep that conversation going with anyone. Let's move on. and get the contribution or the perspective of our panelists. So first, I will suggest that our panelists can briefly introduce themselves, so all of you can understand who are taking part in the conversation today. Susan, tell us a little bit more about who you are, and then I will ask you a few questions.
Thanks, Fareed. My name is Susan Winterberg. I am a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center, Science for International Affairs, in the Technology and Public Purpose Project. My most recent work I've been doing with them is in the area of managing responsible transitions to frontier technologies, particularly technologies like artificial intelligence and frontier life sciences. And my current research is coming out, a little bit of a related topic. I was looking at the venture capital industry and how they manage new technologies that are coming out, and what does that mean as a responsible investor if you're either a venture capitalist or an institutional investor acting as a limited partner in those funds. More related to the topic today, though, before I was in this fellowship role, I was at BSR working with Fareed, and I led our inclusive economy team. We were a team of experts all over the world working on topics of anything related to inclusive growth. That was good jobs, diversity and inclusion, product affordability and access strategies, bottom of the pyramid markets, and developing strategies for how to work with governments and communities in ways that would be inclusive for companies. So yeah, I have a sort of a joint background that sort of spans between academic research and practical sort of business management consulting. So I'm happy to be here today and be able to share some perspectives with you.
Thank you very much. Quick question I can see. Can you tell a bit more about your background in research, what you've been doing recently, I can see?
Oh, at the Belfer Center research, yep. So I have a paper coming out next week that's the culmination of that 2 years of work. That's going to be a roadmap for the venture capital industry and limited partners on what they can do to improve ESG performance in that asset class. So I'll be happy to share that with Fareed when it's out next week, and who can share it all with all of you.
Thank you very much. Romina Boarini, please introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Romina Boarini. I'm the acting director of a newly established center at OECD. It's called WISE, which stands for Wellbeing Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity. And this is a center that in fact was launched a couple of months ago and is going to be in charge of all the work that the OECD is going to do on issues that relate to well-being, inclusion, of course. So it's very much building on, I would say, the last decade of work on impact and going beyond GDP, so, non-financial sort of outcomes, but also obviously on the work that we did on inequalities and inclusive growth. And well, of course, I'm very excited to be in the call. I should thank Fareed for the invitation, but I also want to say that with Susan and himself are sort of partners in crime, because Susan and Fareed were quite instrumental, in fact, in one of the initiatives that we're going to discuss with you this afternoon. It's called Business for Inclusive Growth, which is a coalition of major multinationals that have joined efforts and forces to fight against inequalities. And with Fareed and Susan, we work a lot together, in fact, to get this project on the ground.
Okay, excellent. Ziga, I think if you want to introduce yourself, you need to unmute yourself. Ziga,
thank you very much for it. I have just done that, hopefully successfully. Thank you very much for inviting me to the call. So maybe just a small correction on my title as I see it appearing in the screen. I used to be the special advisor to the environment director in the OECD about 4 or 5 years ago for the period of 4 years. It is my great pleasure to work in that team. But since then, I have worked as an inclusive growth advisor, reporting to the Secretary General. where I was in charge of the inclusive growth framework and indicators for policy action. And now I'm actually leading a team under the Vice Center, whose director is Romina Boarini, and I will be in charge of the country reviews on inclusive growth, of the business for inclusive growth, and as well with the links to the SDGs. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be on the call.
Thank you, and I will be corrected before the presentation is uploaded and shared. All right, so let's move on and get the perspective of Suzanne then as a starting point, sharing considerations on recession, who survives, who thrives, and tell me when you want me to move to the following slide.
Okay, thanks, Fareed. Yeah, so following up to some of the introductory comments Fareed gave about what matters in terms of managing companies during recessions, I thought it'd be helpful if we just start and look at what the business case is for certain choices that are made during recessions, and then I'm going to sort of pivot over and talk a little bit more of what does that mean for social impact and societal outcomes for the implications of these choices. And I'm going to be looking back historically in my remarks, so I'm going to be looking at the 2008-2009 Great Recession, and also some of the earlier recessions like the dot-com bust in 2001. But I think what we know about this research is that the results are holding consistent every time we've repeated these studies over the last 3 decades. So hopefully it will be relevant for COVID recession, but obviously it's going to be a few years before we have enough financial data to really definitively say what was the right strategy for this recession. So perhaps just keep that in mind. So basically what the research says about recessions is that the decisions you make both before the recession and during the recession have very strong correlations to what your financial outcomes are as a company afterwards. And for anyone on the call who comes from finance, a lot of these messages should look similar because they're very similar to what we know about long-term performance of companies in general. But there's also a couple strategies in here that are a little bit more specific to what do you do when there's a downturn. So I'll sort of talk through that. So on the left, this is a graph from a report McKinsey put out last year called Bubbles Pop, Downturn Stop. There's a link here so you can look at it after the presentation if you really want to dig into the data. But basically what they did is they looked back during the Great Recession and tried to understand which companies were more resilient after the recession. So regardless of how they were performing, in the pack inside their industry before, who really was resilient and sort of took off afterwards. And that's the blue line on the top 20% of companies in terms of their performance. And then at the bottom, they have the non-resilient, which are the bottom, the other 80% of the companies. And then what the studies have done is they really go across and just try to classify, like, what are some of the strategies that these companies use that correlate back to whether you're a resilient or a non-resilient company. So the first one is a lot of it has to do with what you do before the downturn happens. So it's sort of in that 1 to 2 year period before, these companies they scenario plan and they have a recession playbook. And in these playbooks can be different things like, what do we do if there's a downturn of demand or new orders of like 10% versus 25 versus 50%. And they have a set of actions in place. And then they sort of socialize that across their organizations. So making sure that your employees know that, at what level would we start layoffs? Like a 10% decline would not result in a layoff, for example, or, are we going to cut travel budgets, or we go sort of what you're doing so that when the actual downturn hits, it's sort of been socialized both with employees or maybe even like your key suppliers so that they know what to expect and it doesn't kind of send everybody into this tailspin of just uncertainty, or that you're not just scrambling around figuring out what to do as, things are falling apart, as, we saw happen very quickly in February and March this year. The second thing they do is they deleverage in the year or two before. This is just so that they have more cash on hand to do things, both to tie over, any sort of cash flow shortfalls, or interestingly, to engage in M&A. So the famous example the research cites is Amazon during the 2000-2001 recession, where about half of the digital tech companies all went out of business, but they had sort of deleveraged quite a bit, so then they were able to more actively invest in R&D and in strategic M&A during that period and really sort of come out of that pack ahead. So there's some good examples in the papers of sort of how these two strategies can play together to help. The other is they decentralize decision making, because you have to be able to be very agile during this period. So centralization benefits companies sort of during growth periods, but being more decentralized so that you can quickly pivot for each geographic market, each customer segment, adjust your prices, adjust your terms, whatever you need to do to sort of keep your sales moving forward through these sharp downturns. So sometimes they already have that in place. Sometimes it's part of the playbook, and then we go back to business as usual, back in the growth phase. And then the other two, reduce costs. So historically strong focus on operating efficiency. So if you weren't doing it already, you absolutely need to be focusing on that during a downturn. Reduce labor costs. For most companies, that is one of their biggest expenses. But also, what the key caveat there is, layoffs are a last resort. So they're using things like short-term work schemes, they're using furloughs, retirement match benefit cuts, like all kinds of other things. And then they invest for the future. So that's increase in R&D, disciplined M&A, and importantly, investing in technology solutions, two kinds: process automation, so streamlining anything that needs to be streamlined or automated, and then having data analytics so that you can become more agile. So, right, so a lot of these strategies are things we just know in general produces good financial returns over the long term. And then kind of the tricky one for recessions is probably reduce costs. And that's where we can have a little bit of sort of a social impact challenge that I want to dig into a little bit more. Next slide, please. Yeah, so for layoffs in particular, there's quite a bit of research on this one. I think in the slide Fareed showed, I think he showed you that graph where you just kind of saw historically what happened from the 1970s to 2008, 2009, where companies in the past would just take a productivity hit during a recession, but they would try to retain their workforce. But over time, I think it's gone something like 90, it started like maybe 70 to 24. Now we're down to something like 99 to 1. You know, they just would lay off their employees rather than take a short-term productivity hit over that, 12 to 18-month recession period. So a lot of the research kind of dug into like, well, does this pay off for the businesses? And what we find in the research is, well, no, it doesn't, for a variety of reasons. So the first one is that when you lay off your employees, you're basically causing almost like a human capital crisis inside of your company. And a lot of this has to do with how people react to the uncertainty of layoffs. So there's less teamwork, more political behavior, top talent tends to leave, employee engagement scores go down. And sort of when you start to have this kind of anxiety inside your organization, it can spill over across lots of different domains. So when you look inside companies that are conducting layoffs, their sales can go down because you have less time with your customers, or your account managers get laid off. So that relationship is then severed sometimes with that customer. R&D, so people are less innovative. There's fewer patents being filed during layoff periods. You're losing your top talent sometimes, and they're taking all that knowledge with them, or you can get delays on your product delivery. Safety, quality, more accidents, more kind of safety violations and cost of rework and scrap, more product recalls, and then brand reputation, legal, political, more lawsuits, more strikes and work disruptions, boycotts, and then sometimes politicians can kind of get involved in this as well, where they sort of run almost like public relations campaigns against companies that they perceive are not conducting layoffs properly. So it needs to be sort of the last resort once you've sort of looked at other sort of cost-cutting centers as part of the downturn, just for avoiding these sort of hidden internal costs that can really sort of derail the company coming out of this. When you just don't have the talent and you don't have your customer relationships or your supplier relationships lined up, so you can very quickly respond once demand starts picking up again. Next slide.
Quick clarification from a participant from the aircraft industry. It's about whether there is a way to give this a value somehow, because you strike an interesting balance between short-term cost reduction and longer-term impact on revenue generation. And are you aware of models that can give those to some numbers?
Looking for numbers on the layoffs, or on the other slide, in terms of models, there may be some of the financial models in the papers that sort of dig into like what they found, where like the exact accounting metrics that they were measuring in terms of like things like the leverage ratio of the companies. So I think like these were quantitative studies, so they did break out what some of those breakdowns were.
Okay.
Was that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so also continuing on the layoffs issue, one of the other challenges is that this is also the area where you're going to have the most social impact as a company. And there's sort of three sort of areas that you start to have impacts when you do layoffs. There's sort of two direct impacts, which are to the workers that lose their jobs in this process, and then there's sort of a collective impact to communities and entire countries and the world economy when this is happening at scale, like it's doing during a major recession or crisis that's global. So the first one is income and wealth. So we know there's a lot of things that happen to people who become unemployed. So one of the first things we know is that they face stigma on the job market. So there's been a number of studies since the Great Recession that like went back and looked at, you know, how long does it take for someone to get a job call back, depending how many months they've been away from their current job. And then they'll send out resumes and things with all they alter, these are sort of made up resumes, but the only thing they alter is whether the person's currently employed or whether they're unemployed and how many months. And they find like it's almost sort of a vertical drop off after 2 months that, you know, by month 9, I think you don't get any callbacks anymore from recruiters if the resume says that you are unemployed. So this can be sort of over time, particularly in these long recessions where it just takes more time to get back into reemployment. It pushes a subset of people into these long-term unemployment cycles where they just can't ever get out of them again. And then reemployment at lower wages. So a lot of times when people are losing jobs, particularly older workers or people with more seniority, they're being reemployed at lower wages. So past recessions, I think the Great Recession, I think it was around 17%, some of the more concentrated ones in the past. Like the most, I think the steepest one was the auto industry, like during the 1980s and 1990s when they were doing the offshoring. Some people's wages fell 50 to 70%. A lot of them were going from, you know, stable jobs, full-time jobs with benefits in auto companies and being reemployed in temporary work. So there can be very strong sort of downward social mobility when you are laid off if you're not able to A, find a job quickly, B, find a job in the same field that you left where you have the skills and seniority. Some additional things that can happen in the United States, for example, 70% of people are living paycheck to paycheck, which means they don't have any savings. So they can't go very long without their paycheck before they start running into serious financial problems. So for example, that could be, you know, just raising credit card debt, risk of home foreclosure, eviction, and bankruptcies, and disproportionately low income and people of color are, as a group, are more vulnerable to this, just because they tend to be in the lower wage jobs where you're less likely to have any savings or social net. But we see it all across the income spectrum, that 70% number that includes all income levels. And then for health, so studies that sort of look at long-term unemployment are saying, well, what happens to people if they're unemployed over, you know, certain period of time? So this is a meta study. It was pulling together hundreds of studies that have been done all over the world on this. So your risk increased chance of getting a physical illness, typically like heart attacks or something stress related, is about 1.8x what it would be for someone who's currently employed. Developing drug and alcohol addiction, around 2 to 4 times increase, and this includes the opioid epidemic. Developing depression or committing suicide is about 2 times higher. And then interestingly, violent behavior increases 6 times among people who are unemployed. Long-term abuse, but it also includes things like property crime, and also looking internationally, things like joining terrorist organizations and different kind of more political crime. But most of like what that 6x is more sort of domestic abuse, mostly child abuse. And then sort of what's the collective impact
I need to make sure that other panelists can have time, Susan.
Yeah, sure. And the last one. So what's the collective impact? So when this happens too quickly all in one place, you lose tax revenues, property values decline, you're unable to fund schools, police, and then social and political unrest. So I think in the COVID world today, we're starting to see this popping up in different places. So historically, this is what happened, and during Q&A, happy to talk more about some of this research or what's going on today.
Thank you so much. And I'll just share a question which might be an entry point for Romina. And as before I do this, I want to make sure that I displayed sources for those asking questions about models and others to make sure that they can have access to those complementary sources of information. Getting back to my slide here, so Romina, just a transition question in a way. Someone is asking, to which extent is that a responsibility? What's the business case for companies to care about those society impact presented by Susan, and to which extent companies, and probably those interested in a coalition like Business for Inclusive Growth, but given your role with WISE Center, you might also have that perspective. But if someone, a decision maker, wants to make a case to invest and avoid negative impacts to societies like those?
Thanks, Corinne. I think this is a great question, and thanks to Susan for sharing those very interesting results. I would say many of them connect to ongoing research at the OECD on how we are kind of appreciating, understanding, and evaluating the social sort of inputs and the social costs of the crisis. But I think the short answer to this question, where does sort of the responsibility of the different actors lies? The way we are, I think, looking at this question at the OECD is that we think this is really, this falls under the sort of remit of both sort of private and the public sector. We're talking of sort of the biggest crisis, actually. I mean, definitely since the Second World War. When we released our sort of latest economic focus, we had to sort of downgrade the focus even more. Then we, did calculate what we had calculated in June, and the cost of the crisis in terms of changing sort of people's lives and sort of livelihoods, especially for the most vulnerable, is also huge. So because I think the scale of the challenge is unprecedented, and as in fact both you and Susan have noticed, the challenge, I mean the crisis, if anything, sort of compounds and exposes and reinforces some of the other challenges, not just the social ones, but also the bigger transformations that the economies and societies were already sort of going through, namely climate change, namely sort of the digital transformation. So the crisis is not just happening, in a vacuum. It's actually happening in a context that I would say was already quite heavy, and so definitely, there is something that is not just a job for policymakers or for businesses, but it's really, I mean, for both of them and for many other actors, I mean, civil society and many other sort of organizations and citizens. I mean, I think definitely we can think that this is something that will require, solutions that are, co-designed and sort of implemented by a number of actors, but very concrete situation today and how that sort of differs, let's say, from the great sort of sections of how the Great Recession will be already on the table. I mean, the economic and social costs. So this debate, for instance, around what is the input on the growth potential of the economies, on the productivity potential. Obviously, every time that a sort of economic crisis is hitting, this is clearly hampering the growth potential, and so the chances that countries and economies grow tomorrow. But perhaps what is very distinctive about this crisis, again, is this connection with the social dimensions of it. And of course, every time that a person loses his or her job, this is generating obviously a negative input on his or her life, and so that is not just an economic effect. It's definitely a well-being effect. That's the way we we frame it at the OECD, and in fact we have done in the past research that was showing that again, the sort of the inputs in terms of people's life, how the lives of people is changed, go well beyond so just losing some money. And in fact, there is a very interesting story to be told around, also the sort of dynamic inputs, if you wish, meaning that when you are losing, your job, this also, in fact, affects the chances that your own children, will definitely not get the same opportunities to get good education and a good job tomorrow. So, this is also something that actually explains why inequality sort of perpetuates sort of over time, and child poverty, increased quite largely in the previous crisis, and this is definitely something that will be a concern this time as well. But what is new, I think, is not just the fact that inequalities today are larger than what they were at the end of 2010. And we know, that to some extent, social mobility is also actually lower than what it used to be. And so, there is this notion of again, social mobility is so stagnating, and opportunities for people sort of to sort of actually be worse today than it used to be in 2010. But I think what is also very, very, big difference is the fact, for instance, that are looking at obviously health inputs that we didn't have in the previous crisis, and those health inputs go well beyond sort of the I would say the physical health impacts, obviously the loss of lives. I mean, that's the first obviously consequence of COVID, but what we are seeing in our economies in the OECD is that in fact the health inputs just on the physical health again go well beyond COVID, because there are many delays in treatment, but also mental health is coming up actually with significant health risks. So if you look at psychological distress, this has increased in many of the OECD countries. Just to give you some sense, in the UK, it went from 80% to 28%. In France, more than one third of the population actually says that they are reporting symptoms of distress. And then this the input on safety and security, which is also something that Susan was alluding to in terms of higher domestic violence. So these are all things that I don't think we were seeing. I mean, definitely we have numbers that suggest that those well-being impacts again going beyond so the immediate economic and social effects of the crisis. These are not, I think, of the magnitude that we saw in 2009. I wanted perhaps to add to that the fact that what we're doing at the OECD, and particularly in the WISE Center, is try to portray this and bring it together, like in a way that it allows us to understand, how do you balance, those effects. And I think somebody put the question, how do you evaluate or where do you strike a balance if you know that some of the interventions that are required to mitigate some of the inputs of the crisis, they come with a cost today, but they may have some more benefits tomorrow. So how do you actually do that? I mean, write out the equation. How do you understand where you have to, what is the right sort of intervention in a way that sort of keeps you going today, but at the same time sort of builds in resilience actually for what you are getting tomorrow. And so we did some work, in fact, that was done in the context of the Great Recession. So we haven't updated yet. I mean, we haven't applied the same methodology to the current crisis. We'll do, I guess, in the few sort of coming months, but I'm happy to share references. But just to say that this work that was essentially putting a sort of a shadow prices, let's say, on unemployment and years of longevity sort of lost with a crisis. So that will show essentially that if you just take essentially the GDP inputs of a crisis, you are underestimating very much the social cost of a crisis. Just to give you an illustration of that, between 2008 and 2013, so during the Great Recession, GDP per capita stagnated across OECD, essentially, dropped by something like 2.5, sort of again on average. So taking all OECD countries together. But if you look actually at the living standards of the poor households, so those living standards incorporate as well the non-monetary inputs of the crisis in terms of longevity, or let's say reduced life expectancy and a higher dissatisfaction from the fact that you are unemployed. So lower life satisfaction and well-being, subjective well-being of people because of your unemployment status. So those standards of the poor households actually by annually. So that gives you a sense, you know, of why it is so important actually to measure the inputs in the right way. Let me now move to the question of, in a way, sort of what is why the OECD and how the OECD is working on the private sector contribution to the inclusive growth agenda. And as I said, in fact, the whole inclusive growth agenda was started at the OECD, in fact, just after the Great Recession, but this is something that we work on now for the last 10 years. And this is an agenda that we, in fact, have pushed with our countries, but also with the businesses we've been working with, just because we see that there is a strong case for inclusive growth, not just in a crisis. It's not just, you know, something that changes the economic cycle. This is something really that is about, you know, the structural transformation and the more sort of long-term transformation, again, that all economic structures and organizations have to undergo. And so in that work, what we did very much put the emphasis on is when we look at what businesses are doing. First of all, of course, the complementarity of their action with what governments are doing. So we did, and Ziga will tell you, you know, a bit more about it. We did some work to come up with a framework for policy action. So on inclusive growth, what governments should be putting in place, you know, to foster inclusive growth. But then what we had to that was essentially trying to understand the business levers. And so how, again, the policies can be, or the actions of the private sector can be complementing those of the governments, and very often, you know, how the governments, you know, can provide incentives to the private sector, which to some extent, you know, to act inclusively, which to some extent goes back to this question that somebody put about, you know, what is the sort of, you know, where is the responsibility, and, you know, how do we know, you know, that there is a role, you know, for the two sectors, but also, you know, that again, that there is also some coordination in what is being done. So we look into that, and for instance, I think in terms of what is coming out from our sort of latest research on this issue, is that it's quite important that businesses and the governments work together, for instance, on all that is related to non-financial reporting. So to try to understand, well, the way businesses sort of measure impact. In some OECD countries, you have governments regulating on the matter. But, you know, first of all, at OECD, we're trying to push for convergence into that, so that there is not just, you know, one approach, let's say in one country or one region of the world, but really we are coming up with on this question on impact measurement in a global kind of, you know, standardized manner. And then the other perhaps interesting work we've done in looking at new forms of social protections, for instance, and there again, you know, how social protection can be revisited also in the light of the pandemic. Of course, it's not just about social protection. A lot of our emphasis, I think, in encouraging governments to act towards inclusive growth is in looking at things such as upskilling, reskilling. So typically, for instance, in what we are suggesting to governments to do now, we're putting quite a lot sort of the focus on saying this is about obviously building potential for people. You know, if they are losing their job, they have to, you know, make sure that their capacity to reintegrate the labor market or you know, to be retrained stays high. And so this is, I wouldn't think this is very new. I mean, we've been saying this and the OECD has been saying that, but what is new is that we are effectively working with some of the companies of B4IG to try to imagine new forms of retraining, new forms of you know, reskilling and upskilling programs that again are co-designed by governments and the companies and are also operated by you know, those two sectors together. And so this is quite new, I would say. This is not something that we had done, you know, typically during the Great Recession. I think where probably the roles of the private and the sort of public sectors were not necessarily sort of brought together consistently. So now we are very concretely through Business for Inclusive Growth, really trying to understand, when we're talking about those big programs that pertain to retraining people. What are the very specific needs that some labor markets have, and very locally, very often we're looking at very specific cities or regions. And so how the businesses and the local governments can work together to put in place training programs that are effective.
We need to keep some time for Ziga as well. So
absolutely. Let me. Okay. Then in this case, I think I actually said what really what I wanted to emphasize most. And please, Ziga, take the floor to provide more details. Thanks.
Yep, that's very welcome, and we have need to stick to a certain format. So Ziga, maybe in just a very few and limited words, how would you share a way forward and concrete way forward for companies interested in committing or engaging, for example, to Before I Did, or other initiatives you might find relevant given the conversation we're having as we speak? And as we say that, there is a poll that is underway for those who want to contribute.
Yes, thank you very much for it. So I think the time is nearly up. So let me perhaps just mention two key websites, and then we can also follow up, and I can explain very briefly what they contain. So one is that I would really like to strike the point that both governments and businesses are making outstanding efforts. And on the OECD COVID website, we have actually developed an artificial intelligence tool to really develop a real-time data tracker of what's going on the statistical side, but also in terms of all types of policies that countries are considering, including to support directly businesses, to strengthen the resilience and to actually improve their prospects for the future. That's one thing. The second one is the OECD Inclusive Growth website that contains the link to the Business for Inclusive Growth press release on the actions that the companies are concretely doing with response to the COVID crisis. And that, what I would like to emphasize there is actually that it's really important that any immediate responses have a very strong strategic component in mind. Concretely, what does this mean? It means that it is very well aligned with the pledge on combating all sorts of inequalities that have been highlighted in Biarritz's pledge from last year, and at the same time responding to the crisis. So that means not to succumb just to some areas that they think that immediate responses would be needed now, and forget about, for example, advancing human rights with respect to fighting child labor, or to build inclusive workplaces, or to strengthen the inclusive supply chains. So very briefly, what companies are doing is, on the side of, for example, supporting inclusive business ecosystems and value chains, they're really providing essential financial assistance, loans, liquidity to vulnerable businesses. They really recognize what is important is that they maintain a healthy client base. They maintain a healthy supply chain of their contacts, of their suppliers. That's one thing that is really important. The second thing that is very important is they have to support their own workplaces. So they need to foremost provide safe environments for the workforce, but beyond that, they also have to support employees' earnings and jobs. They need to maintain the quality of jobs, facilitate the transition of the types of jobs that we are seeing with digitalization taking place more rapidly than have been foreseen before the crisis. And with respect to that, they're thinking ahead how to build and strengthen the resilience for the future. So I would like to stop here because I see that we are almost out of time, but invite you to also send any comments that you have and have a look at these two websites, and we will be more than happy to engage further with you on any of these aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and please share those two website links that will be incorporated in the presentation, which is displayed as we speak. So we make sure that we upload that document that is made available for participants.
I will. Thank you very much.
And thanks so much. Maybe I just want to allow Suzanne to share a closing remark and reaction to what has been presented by Ziga and Romina.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree. I think business and government, this is a cooperative situation where it's going to take both to get out of this crisis successfully. The other thing I would sort of highlight about the crisis is that I think we really need to be intentional about the kind of world we want to build on the other side of this. I think there's a saying in Chinese philosophy says never waste the crisis, and I think this is the perfect opportunity to make sure that we come out into a world that's fairer, more sustainable, and more environmentally friendly than the one that we had in 2019.
Thank you for those remarks, very important. And you're right, we're getting to the end of the hour. So I think LinkedIn is a platform which enables to ensure that you connect directly with interveners if you want through the list of registered participants. We have upcoming webinars as part of that those series of discussions, one scheduled actually next week on human rights risk remediation across the supply chain with contribution from the Institute for Business and Human Rights, IBHR.org, that is partnering on that event. And later in the month of October, as you can see, we have a discussion talking about stakeholder engagement, which, as you can see, has been framed as a thread across many of the discussions today. And later in December, another one, exploring some of those discussions from a different angle, because we will put an emphasis on climate action. But at the end of the day, it will be strongly connected because we'll explore value chains and innovative financing models enabling to accelerate climate action and create jobs at the scale that is needed. And that will be really what we will want to focus on. So these are some of the sources which have been, which enable all of you to dig deeper for more information. You can always get in touch through all of us, through also a couple of elements of social media activities and platforms. I want to close the discussion today thanking very much our panelists for their contribution today. I'm hopeful, and I can see there are many other questions which we've not been able to address, but that the level of satisfaction through the poll, thank you for your contribution to the poll, is very high, and that the number of questions is extremely high as well. So the best I can suggest is to share, I will populate some of those questions to maintain the conversation and hopefully ensure that our panelists have access to those and can interact with all of you directly as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I will close the session now. And as I like to say with those webinars, I think they're very helpful because it's virtual. We can all interact and have some insights that we can share, but unfortunately we cannot continue the conversation over a glass, which will happen one way or another with many of you sooner or later. Thank you very much and have a pleasant day or evening, depending on where you're connecting or watching that webinar today.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.